Thank you. I'm sorry Gillian is not here to give this presentation. But I have been working on the regulatory front for PZP since I was an HSUS staffer in the mid-90s, and so I ended up writing a lot of the original FDA protocols, as well as helping to draft the more recent EPA submissions. So I have some history with this. What I want to stress here is that what we're principally talking about here is the federal and state pesticide regulation apparatus. And we aren't going to be talking about the completely separate process of permitting through state wildlife agencies. So that is a different sphere, and there are different people involved. So anyway, let's see how this goes. All right, so Gillian wanted to talk a little bit about how we originally got here in terms of how fertility control wildlife fertility control came to fall under the Environmental Protection Agency. And it's a long and confusing journey. So EPA goes back to 1970, during that period when President Nixon and the Democratic Congress were collaborating to create a whole raft of environmental laws, including the Wild Horse and Burro Protection Act and the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act and others. And so EPA was a creation partly to or heavily to enforce the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, which it still does. But at the time, the EPA also took over jurisdiction of the enforcement and regulation of pesticides through the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, which had previously been implemented by the USDA. And from a regulatory viewpoint, it makes more sense to me to have it done by the EPA rather than by the USDA because of the EPA's important environmental function as opposed to promoting agriculture. So anyway, this meant that EPA became the authority, the government authority in charge of registering and overseeing and regulating and monitoring pesticides and their use. So it wasn't necessarily easy. Until the late 1980s, there were no fertility control vaccines, so mostly what we were talking about is hormones for control of wildlife fertility. It was a pretty boutique-y science at the time, and it was just mostly some folks fiddling around with hormone implants and deer and foxes and all kinds of other animals. But I don't think any thought was being given at the time to actually running these things through the federal regulatory process. But in the meantime, there was a debate. The debate began in the 1980s about who should actually regulate fertility control. And the sense that they are wildlife drugs or vaccines. And typically, animal vaccines are regulated by USDA, and typically animal drugs are regulated by the FDA. At the time, there was some question about whether the USDA actually could have jurisdiction over fertility control because their authorizing legislation specified that they would have jurisdiction over animal vaccines for disease control. And it was not clear that pregnancy was a disease, and so the USDA kind of backed off, but still had a strong institutional interest in seeing that it did find, the wildlife fertility control did find a regulatory home. So it was felt that either USDA or FDA should manage wildlife fertility control, because again, there are drugs or vaccines, and because USDA didn't feel it had the authority, at least initially, all the jurisdiction for fertility control drugs for wildlife went to FDA. And so our initial experience, the HSUS's initial experience with the porcine zona pellucida vaccine and its federal regulation was writing protocols for the FDA. And so at least from the mid-90s on, the FDA took control over wildlife fertility control. Nevertheless, the institutional debate within the government regulatory agencies continued, and in 1996, the USDA's National Wildlife Research Center, which itself is and has been working for a long time on wildlife fertility control as part of its non-lethal animal control mission, held a workshop to discuss what agencies would have the authority moving forward. And so at that point, it was decided to keep it with FDA, but it also became clear at that point, over the 10 years or so in which FDA did have jurisdiction over wildlife fertility control, that it was not a great match, either in terms of the kinds of things that FDA was interested in. So FDA drug approval requirements are extremely expensive, involve a lot of paperwork, involve a lot of monitoring, and with an intense focus on the safety of the vaccine or the product and how it's manufactured, and down to the details of keeping inventories of batches, and given the scale of wildlife contraception, it just was a bad fit. And so, although we continued to write these FDA protocols, the responses got stranger and stranger over time, and it became clear at some point that the FDA wanted to offload it. So in discussions between the agencies between 2005 and 2006, it was determined that regulation over wildlife contraception would be split between the EPA and the FDA. Yeah, right, and in a somewhat sensible way. So the EPA assumed regulatory management of contraceptives for wildlife that was feral or free roaming. So our deer, our wild horses, anything that's running around loose, but the FDA would maintain and does maintain jurisdiction over for privately owned animals. So zoos, for example, any sort of fertility control in zoos is run through the FDA and not through the EPA. And that is the regime that's still in place. So there, of course, is no specific legislation applying to regulation of wildlife fertility control, because that would be too much to ask, given the pace at which Congress moves, and the general visibility of this issue, which is not on top of Congress's to-do list. So it came to pass that EPA regulated and regulates wildlife contraceptives under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, FIFRA, to use the federal acronym. And so FIFRA provides for federal regulation of pesticides. And so a pesticide is defined by FIFRA as something that can be used to prevent, destroy, repel, or mitigate a pest. And in this case, of course, we're talking about mitigating. And a pest is an animal that can be deleterious to the environment, is capable of causing environmental damage. I'm not sure that the vertebrate belongs in there, because they obviously regulate insects as well. So now that wildlife contraception in free-roaming animals is regulated by EPA under FIFRA, the path for approval is applying for a pesticide registration with EPA. And this is, as my late colleague Jay Kirkpatrick and others have pointed out, it's kind of an unfortunate framing of what this is. Those of us who have been or are animal advocates are pretty uncomfortable calling these animals pests, but that's what the law calls them. And so to register these kinds of things, we need to register as pesticides. So the criterion here is wildlife or wild horses that are capable of doing environmental harm. And so in the registration process, the registering agency, which in the case of PZP is HSUS, has to provide data to support the notion that the product is not going to cause unreasonable adverse effects on the environment. And so the language is pretty interesting here. Normally, the EPA registers rodenticides and awful stuff that you put in the environment that is meant to kill the target animal. And so EPA's regulatory process really is geared about making sure that harm to non-target animals and the environment as a whole, water supplies and so forth, is minimal. And so that's EPA's primary concern. Most of the stuff that's used as pesticides is just put out in some fashion. And so the EPA actually really liked PZP and really likes the other fertility control agents because they're, at this point, they are all injected or implanted in individual animals. And so they do not, as a rule, have widespread environmental impacts. And so the agency's interests in asking questions about the PZP and vaccine and other vaccines are, well, is this stuff going to get into the environment in any way? And second, if it does get into the environment, how long is it going to last and what kind of effects it's going to have? And so in preparing our registration applications for PZP, we stress DART delivery or hand delivery, that the product is the active ingredient is present in only very small amounts, that it's biodegradable, it doesn't pass through the food chain, and that really addresses the EPA's concerns, which are in our view, the most relevant concerns here. So after a process of a couple of years of review, if the proper data is presented, EPA grants a registration. And at this point, only 2 deer contraceptives have been registered. One is Gonacon, produced by the National Wildlife Research Center, and the other is Zonistat D, the form of PZP that is available for deer. And that was registered in July of this past year. So is that it? No, because it turns out that state pesticides also have to be registered at the state level. And for some states, getting EPA registration is pretty much all you need, and then there's just a paperwork application. But for other states have their own specific application process that may require extra data. California, of course, is quite rigorous in what it asks for. So, of course, that varies from state to state. But the point is, for our viewpoint, if PZP or other contraceptive vaccine is going to be used to control deer populations, to manage deer populations, it has to be registered both by the EPA and also in the state where it's going to be used. So that's kind of the next step for where we are. PZP and Gonacon have both been registered as restricted use pesticides, which means you can't go down to a Walmart or Lowe's and buy it off the shelf. It means that there's a set of specific requirements for people who are going to apply it. And in this case, it means they have to be certified pesticide applicators, which is an annoyance, but it's not an overwhelming barrier. Those certifications are given at the state level. We also have some additional training requirements for PZP, which again are not burdensome, but the typical state pesticide applicator exams have nothing to do with the kinds of things that we do with contraceptive vaccines. So in any case, there is that additional barrier. So this is important. So it should be clear that the contraceptive vaccines are getting a lot of regulatory scrutiny before they're approved. And there's still some barriers, specifically at the state level, that need to be met before we can start using these vaccines as management tools. I stress that all of the work that has been done in the past with these vaccines has either been done on captive herds or it's been done under state and federal permits for research. So they've been research-specific applications. So all the things that I talk about this afternoon will have been reviewed by federal and state agencies as research projects. And again, there's nothing available right now, but I don't think it's going to be too long. When I first started out doing this kind of stuff in 1993, people would call me at HSUS and say, how long is it going to be before we can use this in our community? And I would say, 5 to 10 years, which is sort of an indefinite horizon for most people. Kind of like when you go to a restaurant and they tell you how long the wait is, and they say, it's 20 minutes is my experience, right? And nobody has a sense of how long 20 minutes really is. And so it provides a lot. So I used to say 5 to 10 years. Now I tend to say about 3 years. And so as we have pursued these applications, there's obviously a lot to be done, and other speakers will address some of these issues. But as far as the pesticide regulatory issues, most of those should be worked out in the next 3 years or so, pending certain issues being resolved. And so for that part, that is getting done. Again, the state wildlife agency issues are completely separate. So presumably, in order for this to be used as a management tool, every state where it's going to be used is going to have to set up some sort of a permitting process. And that is not something where much progress has been made yet, but we'll work on that. So thank you, and are there any questions? I just want to acknowledge some of the partners here for the regulatory aspects of this. The law firm of Morgan, Lewis, and Bacchius did most of the hardcore legal work for both the FDA investigational new animal drugs and also for the EPA submission. And they talk that language, and I don't. The National Wildlife Research Center, of course, has been a pioneer in dealing with some of these regulatory issues. And of course, the Science and Conservation Center, Kim Frank, and of course, Jay Kirkpatrick, when he was with us, were heavily involved in the EPA and FDA work. And of course, they still continue to manufacture the vaccine.